Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all having a great day. And I'm very excited today because we are going to have a very interesting Ask Me Anything, in which we are going to talk about name credentials and everything around integration with name credentials. We have here today with us Ross Belmont. Hi, Ross.
Hello, how we doing?
Hello, and Ross is a senior product manager for platform integration. He's designed name credentials from the very beginning, I believe. Were you in the previous version of name credentials design?
That's an interesting question. I think they go back to 2013, so I didn't. We can get
Oh,
into a history lesson, yeah. But I think it was at the time when we started to see more on OAuth that the platform really needed this kind of capability.
oh, amazing. Okay, thank you, Ross. So first of all, before starting, let me introduce you this slide that we need to include because we work for Salesforce, and it just means that you should make purchasing decisions based on the functionality that is generally available. But I think that all the features that we are going to talk today are GA. That's correct, Ross?
Yeah, I think. I mean, if somebody has a question that happens to be about something we're doing, there's a possibility we'll talk a little bit about the future, but not primarily.
Okay, fantastic. So with that, let me explain to you how this stream works. This is an Ask Me Anything session. So the idea is that you ask questions to Ross, and Ross is going to try to respond them. You can ask questions on the channel on YouTube, and you can also ask questions on the Trailblazer community and on LinkedIn. Our team mates are going to be monitoring those channels and are going to be sending your questions to Ross and myself. If you want to know more about name credentials in the future, a good place to continue asking questions in a digital way is by joining the Trailblazer community. In the Trailblazer community, we have a group for Salesforce developers in which you can ask your questions asynchronously anytime. And we have people there trying to find the right person to respond to your questions and give you like the answer that you are looking for. So today we have here Ross, and we also planned to have Andrea Guzman, who is also a senior product manager in Ross teams. But unfortunately, Andrea was not feeling well and she won't be able to join us. We hope that she gets better really soon, and we will have Ross, who for sure will do a great job here. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Ross, you can continue from here, giving a short introduction to what these next generation name credentials are, and how people can get use of them. Let me see if I can change the screen. That's there it is. All
Fan-
yours.
Fantastic. All right. Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks everybody for joining. All right, I'll jump into it and have a short bit of explanation up front, and then we go into the open question period. So I'm going to have my own timer right here to make sure that I don't go too far with my slides, and we can make sure to get to all your questions so everybody can be heard. So just in case you're not aware of what name credentials is or what it's all about, I like to describe it, especially for a more of a developer audience like we have here today, as almost a miniature framework, right? In the sense that it's something you build with or on top of that handles HTTP callouts for you, as well as the authentication needed for those callouts to return their responses successfully, whether that's obtaining data from some external system, invoking some kind of action, or somewhere between, some mix of both. You've probably seen, if you have done work so far on the Salesforce platform, that HTTP itself tends not really to be the tricky part, right? The HTTP protocol is well documented, well understood. HTTP exists in Apex. There are features in, Flow that help you make call outs. What tends to trip people up is the actual authentication side, which is where the majority of our work, investments, time goes towards that side of the problem in my team. So, for example, here is a simple piece of Apex that is just making a call out to some endpoint. But as you can see, it's not concerning itself at all with what has to happen for authentication to be successful for this get to actually return what you're intending to, pull from the remote system, right? And of course, the endpoint here is defined declaratively in the setup UI versus being captured in your code or something similar like a custom setting, right? So let's get more into this. Why put these two pieces together, right? So I touched on this a little bit already, but I think it's safe to say that in a business context, nearly all of your API calls, traffic integration is going to have some kind of authentication involved. These aren't just open endpoints, right? Any call out is going to have to deal with authentication in a practical sense for any realistic case in production. And that auth is what can add the complexity to your code, right? That you would really rather not I would say pollute your code with handling for authentication, because it's unlikely that your business application that you're trying to build is somehow about authentication. You need to focus on what's unique about your requirements, your value proposition, because I'm sure you all have plenty to do, right? Let Salesforce handle that undifferentiated heavy lifting when it comes to the details of these protocols, all their variants, and all the small ways in which they can differ, ways in which we see external vendors not conform to specs, things like that, right? You don't really want to have to absorb all that into your code, right? So we have support for OAuth, like I mentioned briefly before. That really kind of kickstarted the idea of bringing name credentials into the platform. And it is wildly popular. It's roughly half of all our callouts, as far as we could tell in rough numbers. But then there are many other ways to authenticate, right? There's basic auth is still popular with legacy apps. JOTs are a good way to be more secure and avoid extra user interaction hassle. If you're building against AWS, like a lot of our customers are nowadays, a lot of our mutual customers, they have their own authentication protocol they call Signature version 4. There are lots of systems that have API keys, arbitrary tokens in a header or something similar. And so these are examples of the popular options that we have coverage for that we are bringing to the table, right? So I'll just hit this point, quickly, right? Why get into this and why leverage this feature? Why is this valuable, right? So the very simplest protocols are easy enough to add into your own Apex code if you really wanted to, but anytime you get off that easy, happy path, you get into more pain and hassle relatively quickly, right? In addition to that, the storage of the secrets, tokens, etc., that you obtain from remote systems can be a hassle or an issue when it comes to security reviews, compliance reviews, auditing by third-party vendors, things like that, right? It's better if your code can avoid sort of touching and manipulating those secrets and stay hands off relative to that sort of thing. You're better off, and you can also avoid placing those secrets in your code repository, which is important to pass your SOC 2 audits. Additionally, if you wanted to use our private connect capability for private routing to popular systems like AWS, you would have to set that up through name credentials. There's no code only option for that to work. And finally, anything that's a code only solution is going to leave your administrators, your non-developers out in the cold, right? And they're not going to be able to participate in that. So we see this in the form of flows usually, where flows either are configured to use the new HTTP capability in flow, or external services by way of invocable actions, which can be added to the flow canvas. And then you can get a completely declarative solution for callouts that has no code at all, right? So this is a quick summary of the main reasons why you should be thinking about using this subsystem and outsourcing your authentication hassles to the platform versus trying to solve it in your own code. It's not something you generally want to do. So I got 2 minutes left. I'll touch on a couple more slides. When I talk about what we've built recently, I like to think of it as sort of expanding out the surface area of what we delivered from this sort of small core capability, originally shipped some years back with name credentials, now spreading out into these other adjacent areas, right? So for a long time, we've had that core protocol and token handling, right? Allowing you to define the endpoints declaratively and not have the actual endpoints or URLs in your code base, right? And as well as offering the touch point needed to get to private routing, to get to private connect. And then more recently, in the past 2-3 years, as I've been on this role in this team, we've added all these other new features and capabilities, right? So support for API keys, very popular authentication method for lots of different types of external endpoints. Client credentials, the client credentials variant of OAuth, very popular for our customers that need to integrate with Microsoft, for example. And then this is part of the OAuth spec. No reason for us not to make progress in that area. Custom claims and JOTs also were heavily requested, so we added those as well. Those help particularly when you're trying to have per user type capability without the hassles of having everyone authenticate separately, each end user, as in a per user OAuth scenario. And then we have some advanced capabilities for AWS, their IAM rules anywhere capability. We've got fine-grained permissioning, which I suspect we'll get into as we get to questions. We now have the ability to share a single authentication sort of definition across multiple endpoints with our new data model. And we have a nice configuration API that we didn't have before to give you more than you'll ever be able to get from the typical metadata APIs. So that's important. I suspect that'll come up today, and I'll probably end up touching on that at least once. And then finally, we actually removed one of the call out limits so that from Apex, you can call a given endpoint as much as you'd like. You may you may bump into other Apex limits if you're trying to do so, but there's not a name credential side limit to that. That limit only remains in your configuration if you're in a developer edition org, which we just don't want people to be able to use name credentials for DDoS. That is my 10 minutes of slideware, and I'll have this. I may jump around and show different diagrams and things as it's relevant to the questions at hand. So we can segue now into the portion where we get into the questions.
Thank you very much, Ross. That was a really great explanation. And I've seen the other slides that you have. They are great too, but as you mentioned, I think they will come up when we respond to some of the questions that we are seeing coming in. So first of all, I wanted to congratulate you because some people is saying in the chat that They are grateful because you are very active in the community and you are responding to questions, and that's like very much appreciated from the community, and they know. So thank you from Niket and from other people who saying hello in the chat. Great. So said that, we're going to respond our first question. And look, you are so popular that questions came in previously because this is a question that came in yesterday. It's from Joey Chang. And the question is, I won't be able to join the stream, but I would like to hear what is the roadmap for APIs in cases when we need to pass the token ID into the URL. For example, endpoint / get data, token ID equals whatever token, and serial number equals whatever. Currently, the only option is putting the details in the header. I want to be able to secure the token there rather than hard coding it somewhere. Do you have a response for Joey?
Yeah, I think I see where we're going with this. So, okay, so let me see if this is helpful. So we have heard of this and we are thinking about it. We will have to work with our security team to make sure everybody's comfortable with the approach that we take to this issue. I'm looking for whether I have any, yeah, this might be a good example here. So, yeah, well, this is OAuth. So basically what we're saying there is that the URL that is the target for the calls would have an API key added to it, as opposed to being a header, which is what we tend to see and would prefer, because then it's not obviously visible, right, to anybody that can see that URL, right? So I wouldn't recommend that anyone use API keys in their URLs as a query parameter unless they had no other choice. But if you are stuck in that scenario, we're thinking about how to do that more smoothly and effectively. Here we see, here's an example where we have an API key for Amazon AppSync, right? So this is set up so that the name credential here, I'm going to call this endpoint and pass the API key that's stored with this principal here. I'm going to pass that in this header, and this is how I refer to that value that's been saved and stored in an encrypted sort of proper manner, right? And you see the use of basically what's a formula here, right? So store the token in one place, refer to it by formula somewhere else. Now, what we need to do, excuse me, there we go. What we need to do is take, probably I think the approach we'll go with is this formula concept and make it such that you can use these formulas in some controlled manner here in the definition of the endpoint, right? Because what I hear this user asking for is a way to edit this and add something to the end of it, which would be some kind of query parameters. It says question mark API key equals XYZ, right? But and then it's the XYZ, that's where you would put in the formula. We have to work on that with the security team because they have a strong stance around the fact that the URL itself shouldn't really ever be dynamic. The domain absolutely cannot be. That will never be okay. So we'll have to work with them to get them comfortable with how we're going to limit it then on our side to not have the URL be something that can be completely built by formula, because the Salesforce administrator needs to be able to know unambiguously all endpoints that their org might be calling out to, right? That's still an important security feature to retain, so they still be able to look at their list of name credentials and see these are the endpoints we're calling out to, and we don't want formulas confusing that any more than is needed. So we have the idea, we've heard the request, we'll have to negotiate that on the security side to see how much we can offer without stepping too far, because we can't really have completely dynamic URLs.
Okay, thank you so much for your response, Ross. I'm going with the next question, which came on YouTube. It's from Bhuvaneswari. And the question is, I would like to know if name credentials can be used to store symmetric key to generate JWT token.
Okay, here's what I think this person's getting at. I think I've heard this one as well. Right now, when you're using our capabilities and we allow you to attach certificates to callouts, right? Let's imagine that I'm going to have the certificate that I add to this, right? Here I can add a client certificate, right, to the call out that will go to this endpoint, right? Okay, so this is how we are exposing certificates now. And that is similar to the configuration you'll see when you choose the fact that you would like to use a JOT, right? So I'll just put this here. So here's your claims, and then you have the signing certificate here, right? Similar idea, right? So we refer to the existing certificates in the org, defined by the certificate and key management side of things. Now, we know that people bump into issues and limitations because of the restriction on what types of certificates that we trust and where those come from, right? That's probably something that you've noticed or bumped into if you've used certificates. And again, that is a security decision in terms of what certs we trust. We're exploring the idea of what it would mean to offer a way to sort of attach an arbitrary additional cert here, or something where you could just paste in the contents of like your PEM file, or whatever that type of thing is. You've probably seen that with other call out tools, right, where you'd paste that in, or we allow you to somehow define that there. So we have an idea for how that could work. I don't have a specific ETA on that feature set at this time, but we've heard that makes sense. I think that we've even sort of explored that idea, tested it a little bit. I think we have a path forward, and it's more just a matter of finding room in the prioritization so that you could attach that here so that your JOT gets signed using that instead of a cert that you would load into the cert capability broadly across Salesforce. So hope that helps, or hope that makes sense. That's how I see that one.
It completely makes sense, Ross, and thank you for sharing what you have in mind and for the roadmap.
Yeah.
This is super helpful. Okay, so I'm going with another question. This time it was asked in LinkedIn from Kalori Ramesh. And maybe you don't want to go into all the details, but maybe you can suggest some resources and documentation. Mm-hmm. The question is, can you explain JWT-based name credentials? I was working with the new Google Analytics services and having trouble in setting up JWT name credentials.
Okay, yeah. I think there's actually a chance that it's the same root issue as the prior question, right? I think it's actually not uncommon for folks to see tutorials online for how to use JOTs, right? And use command line tools. I think it's OpenSSL is the tool typically that people would use to just create their own, JOT type solution, right? Versus going to buy a certificate from one of the popular vendors, right? That would be one that you could load into Salesforce and use for those other purposes. That's probably what happened. But I'll say just broadly that the idea there is that you identify the endpoint, right? So I'll create a quick test here. Oops, whatever, doesn't matter. So we got our JOTs. I'll put the certificate, save it, right? And so each of these pieces are parameters that you pass in that the remote system can understand. And this information that you see here under the claims is basically put into a JSON structure, a pretty simple key value structure that gets signed with the certificate, and then that gets passed along to the server. And then it's up to the server side to unpack this information and look at what's been supplied here, right? And make sense of it and decide whether or not you should authenticate, or that whether or not you deserve access to the target endpoint. So here we see all the like key value pairs that typically go into that JSON blob, including things like expiration, like when this expires, and how we pre-populate values for that expiration time, again here based on formulas, right? But effectively, the client and server, the Salesforce is the client, and whatever external system it is as a server interact. The server looks at the contents of this, decides whether or not you deserve access to the remote resource in question, but it can be trusted that the caller is who they say they are because of the fact that it's been signed, right? And that goes along with the request. What's nice about Jot is that there's no extra step to go obtain a token as there is with OAuth and some of the Amazon protocols, right? So that extra step to go to an identity provider, get a token, and then pass that token to actually make the remote call, that's not needed. And so you actually save a call out. So if your vendor offers Jot, that's a nice thing to be able to do. And oftentimes what we also see is that folks can take, let's see, audience. This is where you can get into emulating a per user access, because you see a lot of systems that support a way to pass a user context in through the Jot claims, often the subject. And so you can know then which user is taking action. And if the remote system is capable of acting differently based on knowing that calling context of the user, then you can get interesting results, right? And you have more than a service account. You have something more, more feature rich, and you can get per user access. So that's where I would start. You can look up a lot of information about using Jots, online broadly. There's tutorials and things like that, but that's how I would think about it from the Salesforce perspective.
Okay, thank you so much, Rosh. There is another question on YouTube from Annie Game, which is not related to this AMA. So what I recommend you doing is to post on the Trailblazer community is a question about content document and content document link. Then there is one more question on LinkedIn, which is about, it says, how about support for MTLS? And this one is from Sridhar Narayan Sai.
Sure. So that would be, I think there's a couple ways to interpret that. And the simplest format is saying that there's certs added to the callouts, which, I've shown a couple different times now that there's ways to attach certs to how you can define your credential, right? So that by itself works. I think sometimes what people are trying to get to when they ask this question is that occasionally we see a scenario with OAuth where Salesforce needs to contact the identity provider to get a token before it can send that token to the target endpoint to get the target resource, right? And then that first handshake to get the token, occasionally different certificates are required to prove the caller identity, to prove the Salesforce identity, or that external identity provider is mandating that a certain cert is needed, or else it will not return back the token in question. I think that's typically what people ask for when they're asking about this. And we do have something in mind for how to get that to work. Sometimes people call that two-way SSL. That would be saying that you send a certificate to the identity provider, and you may send a different certificate potentially to the target endpoint once you have the OAuth token. So we're working on adding extensibility to how you obtain the token from the IDP in question. And then that would give us the opportunity there to attach different kinds of certs, right? And if it had to be a different cert than you use to ping the actual target endpoint, then you just define those separately. So that's, I think, what this person is probably struggling with, and I hope that helps.
It does help. Thank you so much, Ross. There is one more question, which is generic, which is any plans to introduce new functionality in name credentials? So they're basically asking you about the roadmap, and this question was from Nikhil in LinkedIn.
Sure. So let me just refresh my memory. I think the big thing that you'll see relates to that last thing I just said, which is that when you have in today's world an credential that needs to use OAuth, right? Which is, as you probably know and can guess, very popular, right? So here I'm going to have, here's my GitHub example. I actually have this API call, this API endpoint in an Apex class that I wrote something custom to call this API. I'm authenticating via OAuth, okay? And I'm using the browser flow, and I'm authenticating on a per user basis. So each individual Salesforce end user, right, can go ahead and log in separately so that I can access like my GitHub account information, not just general information across GitHub. But in today's world, when you're using OAuth, you have to use an authentication provider. Okay. Now you may be familiar with this, you may not. The authentication provider capability is has a lot of extra features attached to it to handle what I would consider to be inbound use cases optimized around Experience Cloud, particularly log out portal, things like that. These things you see there, that's where that really creates a lot of value, is when you're defining authentication, and that authentication is going to give Salesforce the identity of the inbound user who might be authenticating into, say, Experience Cloud using Facebook, their Facebook account, maybe their Google account, right? Sign in through Facebook. You've seen these types of things online, right? Where you can sign into one vendor using a more popular system, so you don't have to create individual username and password for every other website. Now, this is a construct that we leverage, even though in my scenario that we're talking about here today, there's no Experience Cloud, there's no portal, there's none of that applies, right? We're just trying to get an OAuth token for outbound call capability. So we need to know where to get where to authorize against, where to get tokens from, things like that. How to prove to GitHub that we are who we say we are using the key and secret, things like that. So this capability we need, but we don't really need the rest of this capability. So what my team's going to do, and we'll have a limited sort of soft launch of this at the end of this upcoming release, is our own version of this. We're going to call an external auth identity provider, meant for sort of outbound use cases. So you'll be able to define an external auth identity provider. It'll have this basic information in it. It'll skip a lot of this information about log out portal, things like that only apply to Experience Cloud. And it'll be a simplified setup because it'll all be adjacent to and associated with name credentials. And then you'll be able to refer to that instead of this authentication provider here. And that opens the door for us to do things like I just mentioned, two-way SSL. We can add a lot of customization to how Salesforce interacts with that IDP, right? When we control that piece completely, we can bend it towards our use cases, and we can add a lot to that to help speak to requests I've gotten, things I've heard through support, things I've heard through forums like this, Trailblazer community, etc. So that'll open up a lot of capability for common use cases, especially in and around OAuth. and then you'll see that. You'll also see more there in terms of how that can help ISVs, because we will extend our capability to make that information as packageable as it can be, and then have our control plane configuration API on top of that to populate any secret values that you won't be able to package. The auth provider construct today isn't really usefully packageable in that sense, because you can't package this secret information, but we'll try to provide a workaround to that. So that's the biggest one that you'll see relatively soon that will open new doors for developer and ISV use cases.
Thank you, Rose. Indeed, there was a really related question, which was, what is the new authentication provider alternate for ISVs that you are bringing? So I think you already responded to that,
Yep,
right?
that's it. You'll see Safe Harbor, you'll see an initial API only version of it at the end of this release. So I think that would be then rolling out to orgs in October, if I have my facts straight, right? That would allow you to use that new construct instead of an auth provider, and then we can solve more of the problems and close the gaps that you've probably seen and been dealing with if you're trying to, fight your way through these OAuth related requirements.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. Here we have another question about API keys. In Postman, we can use an auth type of API key and have it add to the query parameters. Is there a similar functionality for name credentials, external credentials? Google API is my use case from our Jones.
Yeah, I think that was our first question, right? If you remember back to that, and that's what that's about. So it takes us back to the same place. Like, this is what API keys look like today. You store them along with the principal. You refer to them by formula, and like I said, we need to just negotiate with our security counterparts the safest way to add these formulas to this definition, so that when you go into their name credential itself and define this here, and you could tack that on and tack on a formula here safely without doing anything that would compromise security for the admin.
R. Jones, if you join the stream late, maybe you can watch it later, the beginning, because Rose did even short demo of that. And then the next question would be from David Church. What are best practices for name credentials in a promotion pipeline?
So I'm interpreting that question to be about CICD, right? And okay, so this is a good moment to segue over here. So if you're interested in CICD, I think you want to take a look at our packaging guide. Okay, so the packaging guide discusses how a large percentage of your name credential configuration can be packaged and deployed and distributed using the metadata APIs that you're used to, except you'll never be able to include any actual sensitive values or secrets with that, right? Why is that? Well, because as you probably know, any metadata you have in your org, you can just export in clear text, XML, using your DX tools, metadata retrieve, things like that, right? You're pulling down the XML of that information locally, and it's all there in clear text. So we cannot have credentials be exportable in that way, and it also doesn't really make sense to trust them on an inbound capacity, importing them that way either. So you automate what you cannot package by way of the configuration API that we now have for the new architecture of name credentials. And the shortest, simplest example of that here is basically you just need to populate those sensitive values that can't be packaged, which are in and around the external credentials principle, right? So if I jump forward here to, say, an API key example, here's where the API key comes into play, and here's how you would use that against this arbitrary REST API. that we have to send this information to say for this external credential, I'm going to add a new parameter, and it's going to be here. There's my API key, right? So in the same way that you'd have REST API calls in your CICD for a variety of reasons, whatever that might be, right? Like maybe you're going to spin up other resources, you're going to provision things on AWS or whatever else you might do, right? You can package and deploy most of this configuration, but you'll need to fill in sensitive values using this approach. And so we have an example here for each popular main authentication approach. So you can see full examples here. That's the thing I would keep in mind. In theory, you could use this API to create the full credential stack completely and avoid packaging. I can understand the rationale for wanting to do that, because then you have everything centralized versus having packaging solve part of it, but you still have to go to the API for this other piece of it. If you were skilled in that CI/CD area, then we offer you the option to just use REST for everything. You can just create the whole thing top to bottom. So you've got options there, but that's what I would draw your attention to.
Okay, thank you so much. Then the next question is from Vidisha in YouTube. And the question is there any timeline when legacy name credentials will move away completely?
I am not sure about that right now. I think that would be, right now I'm considering that unlikely. There's still an awful lot of traffic, right? There's billions of call outs per month that go through name credentials. And there's nothing wrong with that approach per se. It's just going to be missing all of these extra features that we're adding on top of the capability, right? You'll have the dark blue part there. You may not have a lot of what's wrapped around it, right? So that's okay. I think it's also worth understanding that the new architecture has explicit permissioning as part of its increased security posture. And so then you need to know which user groups need access to a certain credential, or really a certain credential principal, to be able to make call outs. And we won't know that for the legacy credentials, so we can't automatically migrate everything, right? So we'd considered that and talked about it, but you may recall something similar some years back where Apex classes behind Lightning components went through a similar process of requiring access to the Apex class, not just the Lightning component, right? Similar effect happened there. As our ongoing commitment to trust and ever increasing and strengthening security posture with the new generation of name credentials, you need to grant access to the principals explicitly so that the callouts work. And that basically prevents us from having an automatic migration. So we'll probably keep the legacy piece around.
Okay, good to know. And then we have a couple of questions that I think are going to be helpful to show. One of the resources that we have, an unofficial SF, which I read today, and I think that is amazing because you explain everything very detailed. One of the questions was from Santosh in LinkedIn, and it was like, how can name credentials be used in integration? And the other question was from Nitish in YouTube, and it was, are we covering external credentials? In yes, can you tell me what's the difference between basic and custom or outflow in external credentials?
Sure, yeah. So I'll jump around a little bit, but I'll echo your point that it would be good to take a look at this in-depth guide, because I touch on a lot of different pieces of name credentials here, the different features, certain limitations, things we're working on, a lot of the stuff we've talked about today. as well as a pretty detailed discussion of the different parts of the architecture and how external credentials are now a unique entity that's separate from name credentials, and all of that. I'll go into it over here. I think I have a slide or two. All right, here we go. This is worth some discussion, so let's hop over here. So as we see on the top left here, the name credential entity stores the endpoint, the target endpoint that you're trying to actually, hit with your code that will return the data in question, right? So that part is relatively straightforward. That's where the URL is defined in the name credential. That's how it's always been even in the world of legacy name credentials. And so we retain that for broad backward compatibility. And the way that you write code against name credentials in Apex does not change at all. That is exactly identical, zero difference to take advantage of this new architecture. The new pieces that we added, notably here, the external credential, which is where the question originated, is where the authentication details are now captured, right? So remember at the beginning, my first slide, we talked about having callouts plus authentication, right? So callouts are the callout endpoint target is captured in the name credential. The authentication to get there is captured in the external credential. So here in this example, I'm going to hit this AWS API, which is called AppSync, to get GraphQL results for a certain data set. And the way that I'm going to authenticate to that and get to that, in this case, happens to be via an API key. Now, AWS supports a lot of different auth options. I could have chosen something different, but it didn't in this case, right? In this case, I'm using something sort of simplistic. I just set this up once, and it works, easily here in Salesforce. Here's my API key. It's part of this principle. It's not going to be shown in clear text, but here it is, right? That this is where the authentication parameter is stored. And then I refer to it later here, like I said before, as part of a custom header. And the header is attached. That's how we know. That's how the external system authenticates requests to this endpoint from us to know to return the results. So callouts plus auth. The callout target is captured in the name credential. The auth piece is captured in the external credential. And the auth piece, like I said before, that's where this gets complicated typically, especially in a case of OAuth, where you have to refer across to some sort of, additional identity provider, and that is a setup of its own to try to manage against, right? So that's where you see more of the value of having a separate entity to capture the details there that are needed to work with OAuth in particular. And like I said before, that'll let us answer some of the other questions that folks brought up today, which would be, well, what if I need to attach an extra certificate? What if I need to do jump through these other hoops when I'm actually interacting with the endpoint that's going to give me the token, not the endpoint that has the data I want, right? So there's so much complexity and so much to manage on the authentication side that it's worth it for us to break out the data model for this, the metadata entity model that we have under setup now. So you define the auth in one place, and we have a ton of parameters around that, and that's separate from the target endpoint. So just to finish up this diagram, I mentioned explicit permissioning a second ago. That's where permission sets come into play. Permission sets will dictate which users are allowed to leverage those authentication credentials, right? So in this case, basically, to go back to this example I've been using, at the moment, we see that I have this permission set, which I just called access external systems very broadly, is linked to this principle. So any end users that have this permission set will be able to access external systems in this way. This is a big difference from the legacy in terms of something you might get tripped up on, because now we have this explicit permissioning such that only specific users that are identified can use these sensitive values to make callouts. Now we do support, though, the popular methods across the platform to try to make this easier to distribute. And that would notably be permission set groups. If you wanted to use profiles, you could, but I'd rather you didn't, right? So you can attach these perms like you attach other perms in the world of Salesforce to the users that need that capability. Anybody that needs access to external systems in this way, they get access to this, then they can make these callouts. So that's where the permissioning comes in. That's an important part of the new architecture overall, is adding that explicit permissioning. You're probably seeing more and more Salesforce subsystems that have explicit permissioning. We would call that secure by default. Just because you created something doesn't mean anybody has access to it, right? So we need to be secure by default. We need high levels of customer trust. Hence, this is important. Then the final piece of this diagram, the user external credential, is actually where we store the actual tokens that we receive from these external systems. This isn't necessarily always even used, and you may recall we talked about JOTs a while ago, and JOTs don't have tokens, so that's not a problem. But in the case of OAuth in particular, and also AWS, where we contact some endpoint to get a token, we need to store that token. We need to store it somewhere. Where do we do that securely? There can be tens of thousands of these per org if you have per user access configured, right? Imagine if your org has 10,000 users. Each user logs in separately to their Google account, for example, for some Gmail or Google Drive integration. We have to store 10,000 tokens just for that one integration. So because of the need to store so many of these tokens, we use a data entity called user external credential, which those users will need access to from an object CRUD level. However, we're working on a way to basically simplify that and put that behind the scenes so you don't have to worry about that, so that our subsystem can securely reach in and use the tokens. There still would be no tab, list view, or SOCL access to this object. It's obviously unacceptable to just arbitrarily query all these secrets. So that's not going to happen just because it's an object, right? But we store it there to give us a place to store things. So as you're familiarizing yourself with the new architecture, this is the piece to keep in mind. Really, these three three pieces are also drawn out here, and I walk through it in sort of an extended example of where each piece gets used. So go ahead and check this out in your extra time.
Thank you for that thorough explanation, Ross. Very, very useful. Okay, so I think we have time for one or two more questions. And the next question, it's about Apex. Can we invoke the name credential authentication from Apex itself? Otherwise, user has to go to set up name credentials to authenticate and need to come back to our app if we are using it in our app. This question is from Salim.
Yeah, I think I see where you're going. So let me go back to, so here we took a look at the packaging guide a second ago. Now let's switch and take a look at the developer guide. Okay. So I think basically what you're trying to do is get the OAuth URL that users would need to navigate to log into some remote system. That's typically the problem, right? Here we see I'm already logged in to my to my GitHub account by OAuth so that this GitHub API integration can work. But you see I had to go to my individual user settings to make that happen. And I had to pick from this, and I had to navigate all the way over here. What you're saying is you don't want users to do this navigation. You want to somehow build that into your app. Okay, that is what this is for. So this REST and Apex capability is now here. And I'll just jump down and you'll see here that we have these classes that allow you to actually get this URL. There you go. That's what you want to do. You want to get this URL for the given credential, and then you use it wherever you want, right? In your custom UI here, we're just writing it out to the log. But what you would do in real life is you would put this into an LWC component, Visualforce page, whatever, to fold this into your UI so that there could be a button like this one to log in or to revoke the access. But you put that in your app. That's what we want people doing, especially if they're ISVs. We know that ISVs want to control more of their end user experience when it comes to this. Maybe you are building a consolidated setup wizard for the installation of your app. We see a lot of ISVs doing this. This is what they need. So if you can create the credential using these other calls up here, this is all sample Apex code that you can take and use, right? So you're creating all the credential pieces that we've talked about thus far on this call, the name credential, the external credential, et cetera, and so forth. You can even grant access to it if you know who to grant access to, because you're creating user setup entity access records. And then you can start the authentication by surfacing the URL in your own UI. So with that, you'd have all the pieces needed for to have your own UI, which is great. I think a lot of folks should probably do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ross. And there you have a link, a QR code for the Apex guide. So we have time for one more question. Remember that the rest of the questions that were unanswered, you can put them in the Trailblazer community, in the Salesforce Developers group, and Ross will be happy to respond in there. I'm going to pick a question that I think was kind of different. And the question is from Ivan Rodriguez in LinkedIn. Is there any way to store an authorization token in a name credential that was retrieved in a first call to be used for a second call?
So I think what you're shooting for there is that's only relevant to my mind when the remote system gives you bizarre, unique requirements that you need to write custom code to solve for, right? And that is an option using there's an auth provider plugin class. And that is an extension off of the auth provider plugin or auth provider capability that I showed a second ago. And so this allows you to write the code in Apex that interacts with the token endpoint if you need to add extra pieces to it, extra headers, put extra things in the body, etc. So you implement these methods, and that lets you take control of that handshake, obtain what you need to do, but pass it through so that we get the token and we store it. We don't really want you storing the token. You kind of should treat it like it's radioactive, and you should not touch it for security reasons. So the right way to do this is to use this framework here. That extends what auth providers can do. That's where you define the handshake with the IDP. This lets you customize it, right? But part of this implementation involves a pass-through that gets the token stored in our structures as if you hadn't needed to write that code at all, and we handled it all out of box. And then it would just work smoothly, just like the GitHub thing I was showing, which is per user OAuth. So that is how I would approach that one versus worrying about defining your own storage. We don't really want to see customers doing that.
Okay, thank you. So I think with that question, we're going to wrap up because we are at time. I want to thank you, Rose, because your answers were like really complete, and I think that the audience really appreciated this. There were many questions that were unanswered, so you have work to do after the stream on the Trailblazer community, and this is good news because it's a very popular topic. It's also a very complex topic. So I'm glad to have you here, and also I was impressed with the level of knowledge of the audience, right? The smart questions that they asked. I want to thank you also, all the people who joined in LinkedIn and YouTube. If you want to connect with us here, we have all our other channels such as Twitter and the developer website where we publish blogs and videos talking about technical topics like this one. And with that, I want to thank you. Sorry, there it is, for being here today. And remember to join our next Ask Me Anything in July, for which I don't remember the topic, but Christy Fidura is going to put it in the chat right now for sure. Thank you, Ross.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Great session. Thanks for your questions.